think with the rise with so much digitization around us, and I think especially with the rise of AI, craft is king right now.
Welcome, folks, to another fine episode of the Pencil Pushers podcast, where we celebrate the love of the hand-drawn arts. I'm, as always, your humble host, Mike Rosado, and today I am honored to be joined by one of the world's leading masters of penmanship, Jake Weidmann. Jake is one of only a handful of certified Master Penmen working today, earning the title as the youngest artist in modern history of that particular realm. His work blends classical calligraphy, flourishing, and fine art, and has been commissioned by collectors, institutions, and brands as big as Apple. Beyond his artwork, Jake is a dedicated family man and co-hosts the podcast of called Made to Last with his wife, exploring creativity, faith, and building a life that lasts. In this conversation, we'll explore how Jake became a master penman, the tools and techniques behind his work, the clients and projects that shape his career, how he balances a demanding creative life with family, and it's a sizable one, and also a sizable one to my understanding, and why human craftsmanship still matters today. Something we obviously talk quite a bit about here in the podcast. So without further ado, I invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation with the man, Jake Weidmann. Jake, welcome to the Pencil Pushers podcast. It is so great to have you here. I'm incredibly excited about this conversation.
Well, thank you for having me, Mike. And yeah, it's a real pleasure to be on. I always love to talk shop, and so this really seems to be the place to do it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, as I've talked about before we got into the actual recording of this, we have a wide variety of different people who have a deep love of the hand-drawn arts, coming from different areas of expertise and interests. So I would love to always start these conversations out with just getting to know you from the beginning, where that spark of wanting to do this in the first place came from.
Yeah, I mean, I've been drawing all my life, and it's always been like my favorite pastime. And my parents always described me growing up as like sort of that quiet kid, but they never worried about me if they couldn't find me, because inevitably I'd be up in my room, stole away somewhere with a drawing pad or a coloring book, just whiling away the hours. That was my favorite thing to do. So I've always loved it. It's always been, a deep like passion of mine and a part of who I am, but I was never able to like go to any sort of formal school for it. So I'm very much self-taught. Every medium that I've done, has just been learned through experience. And I was actually rejected from art school, which we might be like get into at one point. But outside of my mentoring program, in order to become a master penman, I have been entirely self-taught. And I think, it's just, we live in such a special age where it's very easy now, especially in the last like decade,
10, 15 years. Yeah.
That, there's so much to learn. There's so much right at your fingertips and skills being shared around the world. So it's been a lifelong passion, and it's continued to grow. I started off just doing pencil and really striving for realism, having a deep love for realism growing up. And then I started branching out into a lot of different mediums, just wanting to explore, so I've done acrylic painting and oil painting and airbrush, and I've done sculpture in wood, bronze, clay, and even antler. So there's been a lot of different mediums that I've dabbled in. And right now, at this point in my life, I almost feel like there's a bit of paring back, a little bit of focusing in on some of my core ones. But I am always hopping around from one medium to another, depending on what commission is on the table.
I know that there's so much to unpack in what you just said. I have lots of questions. And one of the things I want to come back to is there's one piece that you've been working on for quite a long time. We'll dive into that one. For those that are listening, I invite you to definitely go check out his website, which I believe is just jakeweidmann.com.
Yeah. And it is Weidmann, by the way.
Weidmann. I am so sorry.
No worries.
Jake Weidmann.
People get that wrong all the time. It's the German spelling. It throws people off.
Got it. Thank you so much for clarifying that. So Jake Weidmann, and it's with two N's. So it's JakeWeidmann.com.
Yes.
And you can also find that at Jake Weidmann on Instagram. So in that in particular, you'll see kind of his journey throughout what seems to be at least a couple of years of building this piece. We'll get into that. I'm going to leave that as a mystery that you can start looking up while we
Yeah.
continue this conversation. So in the beginning that you were talking about, you were saying, I believe you used the words weren't allowed. Is that just because of financial or what was, or maybe you could, sort of elaborate, like in the beginning, you were saying you didn't get formal training. Tell me about the dynamic there. Was it just, lack of resources, or was it just kind of happenstance? Did you just have
You
a
know,
busy
I didn't
family
even
life
really
or?
yeah, I didn't even really think to ask for it when I was really young. I was just very content to just, discover for myself. And so I didn't ask for art lessons growing up, and I was homeschooled. And so, there would be collaborative like homeschool programs that we'd go to, and there would be art classes there that I used to love. And I took every art elective in high school. And by the time I got to high school, like, even my teachers at that point were like, "Jake, you're skilled beyond what we can teach you. So like you just do an independent study, we'll give you the credit, and just tell us what you want to do." And so that would be everything from like large scale drawings and paintings to even carving a carousel style rocking horse in wood shop. And so it was just as long as I was given the platform and the opportunity, I didn't want for too much more than that until I got to like college. And I wanted to pursue art as a full-time career, but was really discouraged. And as I'm sure many of your listeners have been in their life, like, you don't want to be a full-time artist. You can't make a living doing that. So that was really discouraging because I wanted to delve deep into my passion and learn to grow my skill at the academic level. And they were just but I was like, instead of doing that, instead of saying like, well, I won't do that as a full-time career, I'm going to go to school for psychology. So I got my degree in psychology, but I
Wow.
thought I was like, I wanted to do art therapy. And I thought that that was sort of a great way of sort of melding my education with my passion. So in order to become an art therapist, you have to have your degree in art.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, well, I'll at least get my minor while I'm getting my major in psychology. So I applied at the art program where I was going to
Where was
school.
this?
This was Biola University. So it's a pretty decent sized private Christian college out in La Mirada, California.
Okay.
And they had a pretty robust like art program. And so I, assembled my portfolio and took it before the chair of the department, and he got like maybe halfway through my portfolio and just closed the book and scooted it back across his messy desk and said, "I'm sorry, you're just wrong for our program." I was really taken aback by that because I'd always excelled as an artist, and I had won even some national awards up to that point. But for someone in the academic realm to just not even take a second look at me was a massive discouragement to me. And I thought finally closed the door on ever making a career out of my art. So luckily, that wasn't the last chapter of that story because I went on, even that week, I was reached out to by a professor in another department, and he wanted to commission me to carve his family crest into a set of like trophy size moose antlers. So, and it was a commission that was much larger than I ever could have imagined. And so I didn't have studio space. Obviously, I
In
wasn't an
terms of
art student.
scale or in terms of what he was willing
Price.
to
It was
pay?
it was
Wow.
mainly
Okay.
price. Like I had done some murals and stuff like that up to that point, but and this was probably, I mean, the largest bone carving that I had done. And carving antler is not easy. I mean, moose antler in
Imagine.
particular is the hardest bone in the world. It's actually one of the fastest growing animal organisms because they grow, these solid bone antlers and then they shed them every year. So,
Right. Wow.
so it's an incredible material. It doesn't quite polish up like ivory, but it has like you can carve it down and polish it to the point that it has a beautiful luster. But yeah, so it was definitely one of the larger carvings I had done up to that point, and this professor was able to pay me handsomely to do it. And so it just gave me like kind of a renewed hope, thinking like, here I want to pursue a living as an artist, And I thought, going through the academic wormhole was my only way through. But here opened up a brand new gate to do that immediately with the skills I already had at hand.
Did you have any inclination? Where did your mindset sit at that crossroads right there? Right. Because it feels to me like you could have easily said, I'll take this money and create something beautiful for you. Thank you. But
Yeah.
I will also use this as an avenue for me to go a little bit deeper or even try other universities or art schools to potentially get into other than that one,
Yeah.
which could have been, kind of a singular incident. It's hard for me to imagine that there wouldn't have been somebody else that would have come in there and said, come on through. Like,
Yeah.
where were you sitting at that?
I think it kind of reframed my thinking around the academic world. And then I was also, the grass is always greener on the other side of the hill, as the proverb goes. And so, I always thought like, man, the kid, like my fellow students who are in the art program, they just have it made. They get to make art every day and, do what they love. They were really stuck within the parameters of a set assignment, and they had to follow not only like the curriculum that they were given, but also like the mediums that were provided and listed. And I was like, and being able to do a commission like that sort of opened my mind to like, wow, I can really set my own schedule as to what I want to learn. And I can pick out the mediums because nobody's teaching moose antler carving at any, school that I know of. And so, it was just it was a good opportunity for me to like widen my gaze as to how I could still feed my passion while getting my degree. Because the truth of the matter is I really did love studying psychology. And I thought in a lot of ways it helped me even reframe my own artwork and understand, what I was really getting at as on sort more of like the ethos level of my art. That
Mhm.
all of my art is sort of this bid for connection, to use a term from psychology. And so, but relationship requires that you sort of meet the other person halfway. So if I create something in my artwork that is deeply personal and deeply subjective, then that's going to be out of reach for the viewer. You really have to find that sort of common space that you have with the viewer and then strike that chord and let it resonate. But a lot of artists that I found trying to make art, they confuse being personal with being subjective. And so they end up erring too much on the side of subjectivity. They're too drawn in and not really reaching out to the viewer in a way that bridges that gap. So even there, I found like great resources in what I was already learning, and I let that sort of become the undercurrent for how I was going to make my art more far reaching and even market ready.
I'm very curious as to what, I don't even know if you'd be able to answer this question, but I'm very curious as to what peace would look like to you if you were to lean strictly into the more subjectivity of a piece of work, right? Where you're not necessarily trying to connect with the other person who's experiencing it, but it's just something that's completely internal for you to some degree. Like, have you ever leaned into something like that where you're not necessarily thinking about how you call this the bid for connection?
Well, I was doing it up to that point. And so for me, I mean, I was like, I was drawing portraits of my girlfriend.
Right.
So, and it's like,
That's a bid for connection, I am sure.
yeah, right. It was certainly a bid for that one connection, but when it came to everybody else, it's like, "That's great. You're obviously very
Right.
passionate about your girlfriend. She's very pretty, very nice." But, who's really gonna wanna buy a print of Jake Weidmann's girlfriend, Like,
Right.
there's a limited market for that, A mom, I guess. So that was where I had leaned into it, and then it was sort of like, oh, opening me up to even the market feedback. And this is something that I'm sure we'll get into on a deeper level, because it's something that every artist deals with in the marketplace, is like, how do you live in this in this sort of duality of like art that you make, which on the one hand comes from this sacred space of your studio, and it's filled with so much like of your own blood, sweat, and tears. it's infused with so much of your own passion that it has this great intrinsic value. So putting a price tag on that, all of this sudden feels dirty and cheapening, even if it comes at a high price. And sort of living between the sacred and the sellable is very like hard to do as an artist, and something that I don't, I don't know if I would have experienced as much as if I had just dug in and actually tried to appeal. Like one of the other jobs that I got in college was doing t-shirt design for a clothing company. Now, this was back during the time when Affliction and Ed Hardy were really having their day, and t-shirts were selling for like $100 a piece, and they were all bedazzled and bejeweled and everything. But I was actually connected to this clothing company from an art student in the program who was like doing their internship there. And he saw what I was doing, because at that point I was delving into calligraphy and flourishing and starting to integrate my realistic drawing with flourished calligraphic lines. He looked at it and he goes, "I think the guys at the clothing company would love to see your stuff." And so when I went into them, they like ate it up and like immediately contracted me for like, I think it was like 4 or 5 drawings right off the bat, saying like, "This is a massive, this like eagles are selling really right now like crazy. Do something with an eagle." Skulls, of course, were, they're so overdone. They're so in your face. And I didn't want to do a skull. So I was like, that was like one of the assignments that they gave me. And so I was like, so in that way, I was like, okay, this is what the market calls for. There is something that is attractive about the human skull, mainly for its shock value. And I never wanted to be a shock artist, because I'd much rather invoke a reaction than provoke one. But the skull, I was like, I'm going to put on my psychology hat and sort of figure out, why is it that the skull is so attractive to us? Like, why is that? And I was like, oh, it is the face of our mortality. Going back to like Hamlet and looking in the face of the skull. And so I was like, okay, well, in my calligraphic style, I'm going to compose a skull entirely made of script, beautiful flowing script. So you're sort of like dressing up this harsh image with the beauty and flourishing of legible letters, but not just any script. I was going to do it based on all like, poetry, songs, scripture about death, and sort of man's reflection on their mortality set in the face of their mortality. So even though it was like, it's a t-shirt design, it was going to be sold at Urban Outfitters and stuff, I was like, I still wanted to really exercise my skill as an artist and think through this on a deeper level. And that ended up being like a super popular t-shirt design that they absolutely ate up. So for me, that was like great real world experience for figuring out, what is actually going to sell? What can you bring to the market? And how does that market feedback, how does that fiscal feedback, as I call it, sort of inform the creative process? Because there's this beautiful exchange that happens between the artist and their viewer that a lot of artists miss out on. And Dorothy Sayers, actually, she was a playwright who worked alongside like J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And she described sort of this trifecta to the creative process. She says there is the conception, and that is where you're conceiving of the idea. Then there's the incarnation, where it comes into being. You're choosing the medium. You're determining the subject and composition and everything else. And that is the incarnation. Both of those steps are in the realm of the artist. But then there's the response. And the response is actually the third portion of the creative process. And that comes from the viewer themselves. And so this reframed my thinking that an art piece is not finished when I've laid the last stroke or when I've signed my name in the corner of the page. It is finished when it is seen and responded to by the viewer. Because in so doing that, the cycle is repeated. Because once that response is there, then that helps me inform like, oh, okay, great. Well, this resonated or this didn't. And so that's going to inform the way that I conceive of the next thing. And so I develop this beautiful relationship with my audience. And it's like, I don't want to always be playing to the crowd, but, there is something to be said that while a good artist has a well-developed voice of their own, I think a great artist is one who is the voice of those around them, one who is
Mm,
able to put in words what other people cannot, one who is able to put in pictures what can't be captured in words. And so that is the thing that draws me in and developed, like, helped me really see like a real appreciation for that interplay of me with the viewer and how that actually ties into this complex relationship in creation.
that is some juicy stuff, Jake. I think that these are wise and hopeful words for particularly the creative living in the world 26, where more than ever, we have the opportunity to wield control of our destiny as artists. And of course, obviously we've got
Right.
we've got the twists and turns and ups and downs of which the technology age can make things a little bit more challenging, right?
Right.
But we still have the opportunity more so than ever with the advent of social media, digital tools that help us create as independent artists. I think it's such a great way of seeing it, which is what I'm hearing
Mm,
is a creative has the opportunity to have the consumer being the receiver and the one who responds as the third party, right? It's the third
yeah.
phase of that process. And they
Right.
are there to vote by saying, yeah, I'll take that. I'll purchase that. That is amazing,
Right.
right? So now it really is sort of an advocacy for, yeah, no, this cycle of being an independent artist and selling your art as a consumable versus something that just is held up on a wall for one person to enjoy in their home.
Mm,
There's opportunities for a lot of that bid for connection
right.
by doing sort of things that are coming from a more sort of like economical or consumer based response and receipt,
Right.
right? Does that
Right.
that make sense? So,
Absolutely.
and it's interesting too, because your artwork in particular, I would think that there would be an easy lane for you to take as somebody is doing something that's so vastly different than so many others today in terms of
Mm,
the high quality, but also the actual work of calligraphy and
mm,
you being this penman. There are not many people who are doing that, right? They
right.
are going to say that is a bygone era.
Mhm.
And it's interesting for you to, I could easily see you going, no, this is for me. This is for whoever tiny little segment of people that still love this type of thing. That's for them. And I don't need to expand and be a part of, the broader world of people that can
Mm,
consume the product at, you know, in mass, if that makes sense.
right. Right.
Which
Yeah.
I love your perspective of that. And so backtracking a little bit, I'm very interested to see, obviously you're interested in so many different areas of creative application, whether it's fine art, painting, sculpting. Tell me about how you really started to drill down into this passion of calligraphy, of penmanship. Walk me through that. Where did that start?
That started really, I mean, it started very much like adjunct or parallel to my passion for drawing. I had this very like early on conviction that it was like if I was going to be an artist, then it should be like it should permeate every part of my being, and every time I put pen to paper, then the result should be beautiful. And I loved cursive handwriting. Like since I was very very young, my mom had beautiful handwriting that I always admired. I loved the flowing lines across the page. I loved how it looked like, flowing water and falling rain at the same time. It was so beautiful. And so I really latched on to cursive handwriting and just obsessed over my penmanship for the longest time. I had dabbled a couple of times in, what are traditional forms of calligraphy. Now, a little bit of an aside here, calligraphy is just the Kali means beautiful and graph to write. So it's just beautiful writing. So I think, in my definition of that word, it encompasses a lot. But as to like
Interesting.
true traditional forms of calligraphy that you see, like italic, I had dabbled in that a little bit when I was young, but I didn't love the as much like not having the strokes connect and having the fluidity of script. And I looked at earlier forms like historical forms of copperplate calligraphy, which does have the interlocking letters with these beautiful hairlines and thicker, they're called shaded strokes, where they swell gracefully and taper back down. And I never knew exactly how that was executed. And from time to time, I try and mimic it by like drawing it in sort of Doyle Young fashion, where he just did everything manually by hand. If you don't know his work, he was brilliant. But so it was in college that I was in a cognitive psychology class, and this girl leaned over to me at one point, and she goes, I'm engaged to get married, and I've been going through like a slew of wedding calligraphers trying to find someone to do our wedding invitations, and none of them compare to your class notes. And she said, she's like, would you
Your
mind like,
class notes. That's
yeah.
amazing.
I mean, and I was always like, it's so funny, like talking to other students of mine in class, because I was always the last one to finish my essay tests and everything. And at the time, I was pursuing bodybuilding too, so I looked like this big,
Uh,
jock who didn't, do the
right.
studying. And so my classmates always thought, they were like, "We just thought you had totally like spaced the essays and whatever." And I was like, "No, I was focused on my handwriting. Leave me alone." And to the point that like my professors even wanted to keep my essays. They're like, "Jake, you got a high grade. Here's your grade on the test." And they're like, "Do you mind if we keep your blue book? Because this is really spectacular." So that was pretty cool. But anyways, this told me that she wanted me to design her wedding invitations, and I was like, "Look, I'm using a ballpoint pen here. I don't know a formal style of calligraphy, but I said I'll do some research. I've always wanted to try and like figure out, even if I have to learn how to cut a quill, I will. I'll go figure out how to do that." And so that evening, I went on search and started finding these terms like copperplate calligraphy that seemed to fit the bill of what I was looking for. And then I found this video of a master penman, John DeColobus, and he's the greatest ornamental penman alive. And he was writing with this crazy instrument called an oblique penholder. It looks like an awkward dental instrument, honestly, but it's
Right.
this, tool where the nib is offset on the side, but he was writing like white ink on black paper. So it was just all the more dramatic. And he's using whole arm movement. And so it just looked like I was just seeing these gorgeous letter forms appear on the page, out of the dark in his white ink. And I was hooked. I mean, I was just like, that is exactly what I want to do. And then I figured out what a master penman was and the rich tradition of Master Penman. And I was like, yes, I want to be a part of all of that. And that became this goal of mine. So I jumped in, head first, and started attending Penman conferences. Not many people know that Penman.
Attendance of seven.
That's I mean, it was less than 100 the first time I showed up, and a sweet old lady came up to me at one point. She goes, "Young man, are you lost?" And I was like, "No, ma'am." I said, I think I'm found, actually. I said, "I'm here
Oh,
for the
I
Penguins
love it.
conference." And it was just beautiful. I mean, they welcomed me in with like open arms, and
Right.
everyone was teaching me everything that they could. They had this massive collection of historical penmanship that they bring to each one of their conferences and set up in one of their like in a room, and it becomes sort of like this like pop-up museum of American penmanship. And so I was just in heaven. I was absolutely hooked. And my eyes were just open wide to the possibilities of what I could do with the right tool and the right like craft to pursue. And so it was just, that was sort of the kairos moment for me, was seeing that video of John DeColobus and venturing long down that rabbit's hole. And so eventually I got my Master Penman certificate in basically the shortest time allotted. You have to be a member for 5 years. So I was studying, night and day. I was still getting my degree in psychology, but I was starting to do and I was like upping the ante. I started doing my homework assignments with a dip pen and an inkwell. And so I took every opportunity I could to practice, to hone my skill, and then eventually became a Master Penman in in 2011.
So back in 2011, you were how old at that point?
I was 26, 26 back
26.
then. Yeah.
And at that point, you were aware that you were the youngest to receive that recognition or that certification?
Yeah, I was actually I didn't know that until the head of the program, Michael Sull, he's another master penman, and he's an amazing like penmanship historian. He said that as he was signing my certificate, which you actually, in order to become a master penman, the final test is you have to execute your own certificate. And so, and you're judged, you have to, while the language is standardized, own you have your own sort of like creative jurisdiction over how it's laid out, how it's ornamented. But the many different disciplines of the different forms of calligraphy, illumination, border design, flourishing, all have to be represented in the certificate. And so if it passes muster, then it's signed and presented back to you. If not, you get one more chance to do it over. And then you have to kind of be kicked back to the back of the line for another several years or so.
Wow. Now you and your team sent a series of images before we got together. There is one that is simply called Penmanship Grayscale Master, and it is an illustration with that's got flourishes like crazy. There is a hand, a man's hand with the quill pen,
Well, yeah.
incredibly detailed, lots of flourishes, and it says penmanship, the pen empowers the man. And I would like to know a little bit about, because unfortunately we don't have a ton of time, but I'd like to help this bridge us into talking about your process and let's let this be the starting point of it. Talk to me
Okay.
about your process, and maybe we can use this as an example, because then we can showcase this in the video that we'll showcase as well, but also we can kind of talk through it when we launch the episode on Instagram to let people know about it.
Okay. Yeah, my process is pretty hard to nail down depending on, it differs per the medium and also the approach. But on something like that, let's take calligraphic work like that, which is not what you just described is a title piece called penmanship. And every penman sort of does sort of their own kind of penmanship propaganda piece. And this was mine. It was sort of an opportunity to glorify the art form.
Yeah.
So it's everything within there. There's lots of like Easter eggs that build the composition of the piece. Everything from the quill to the oblique pen holder, which was that was the tool during the golden age of penmanship. The paper sprawled out underneath the hand, glorifies that as a writing surface. And then a gorgeous inkwell is drawn there. And there's like a bird flourish. And so I think of all of the different things that I want to sort of build into the composition. But whenever you're doing a calligraphic work, there's many things that you have to consider in the composition in order to make sure that everything is legible, that it communicates well to the viewer and has its place of prominence. So there's a lot of, pretty similar to most processes. It starts off with some exploratory, like thumbnail sketches, and then sort of builds into something that becomes like a full draft. It looks like an architectural blueprint, especially when you're dealing with like drawn lettering and stuff like that, to make sure that the structure and the angles and everything are absolutely spot on. And then from that, it's transferred onto whatever material, whether it's fine paper as that one is, or calfskin vellum, which is what I really prefer now. And then you start building it out and based on your medium. And then there's always room to, like, while the core of the composition is sort of laid out, or while I have the main structural lines to like that, the very detailed flourish that's within that piece, when it comes to the final execution, there's further gilding of the lily that happens, impromptu. And so I'm sort of filling out the flourishes with all of its detail and all of the different memorized pen strokes to build those flourishes. And I sort of pick and choose and build it out like I'm creating a bouquet of flowers, making sure it's filled and balanced and even and interesting. There is always rules that govern its beauty. And that was the magic that I found in the art of calligraphy and learning like true forms, true historical forms, that they weren't just creating willy-nilly, but even ornamental penmanship, which is this crazy form of script that has massive amounts of flourishing stemming off of the letter forms. All of those were very carefully executed and they all obey rules. It's like you're creating a dance on paper, but you don't want your letter forms to look like a mosh pit. They have to be doing the foxtrot. And so each stroke has its moment on the page to shine. So that's where they build to a big, bold, shaded stroke. Whereas the lines, if they cross between them, will cross perpendicularly and at a hairline. And so they're essentially bowing out to the other strokes that have their moment on the stage. And so this is beautiful because you become sort of the choreographer of the grand dance on the stage of the paper. And so it's incredibly fun, and it can get so complicated and a little bit dizzying, but but that's what helps you work out those problems. And when you really know those rules, some people say you learn the rules to break them. No, that doesn't make sense. Then what's the point of learning the rules? You learn the rules so that they can set you free, because then you are free to create that thing without creating a problem on the page. And now you can really stretch your wings because you have the guiding hand of past masters upon you.
Love it. Now, it looked to me that this particular piece is a mixture of potentially like a graphite pencil with India ink, or am I way off?
You're not way off. No, actually, it's a combination of pencil, charcoal, and gouache. So I mix
Interesting.
Gouache is actually mixed down to an ink. The reason why I chose that versus like the other traditional inks are iron gall, which is like very traditional, but it's highly acidic. And so it's definitely not archival. It'll eat through the paper. It might take
Mm.
100 years to do that, or it'll rust on the page because of the iron content, which is why like our Declaration of Independence is a sepia tone. When it was originally written, it was black, black. But what you're actually seeing are the letters themselves rusting on the page. So
Wow.
when I create a finished work, I want it to be true black. So a lot of times I'll go to Sumi ink, which is a Japanese stick ink, which is basically been around for almost a couple thousand years to their best knowledge, but it's just carbon in a binder. But for this one, in order to make the surface texture of the ink play well with the flatness of charcoal and pencil, I used gouache thinned down. So I use like almost like a scientific stir. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but they have like a little magnetic pill that sits on a platform. And so you drop the pill into your inkwell, and then the magnetic platform continually stirs the ink. So it keeps all of the pigment suspended in the solution. And then
Mhm.
I mix in, like gum arabic and maybe a little bit of ox gall to add to the fluidity of the ink. You have to be a bit of a scientist. But the result is it creates a beautiful flat black ink that's on the pages that's wonderfully archival and plays a little bit nicer with charcoal and pencil.
I would have to imagine you got to talk to me a little bit about your margin of error situation here. It seems to me like when you're working on something that's probably taking hundreds of hours to produce, I'm assuming that some of these definitely do. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Please, even actually don't just lie to me and tell me that it takes hundreds of hours to produce this. But I cannot imagine that, like what happens in the studio of Jake Weidmann late at night when you're 90% there and you spill ink all over the artwork that you've been working on for so long.
Well, that really depends on the substrate. If I can get, and it's fun to actually be able to talk technical about this stuff because most people like would be bored to tears. But knowing your audience, hopefully they get something of interest out of this. If it's paper, there's very little forgiveness. There's always, I think a master is not one who never makes mistakes. I think a master is one who learns to use their mistakes and correct them where necessary. I actually wrote about this in a book that's coming out, a whole chapter called pentimento. Pentimento is an Italian term used for traditional painters, and it quite literally means a repentance, a change of direction. So it's usually late in the process, but through radio, like spectrometry, I think is what it is, where they like can X-ray paintings now. They can
Yeah.
see like where Rembrandt had his
Had
pentimento
redone.
change the composition of the piece. So I think there's, as I've gone on, I've learned how to work with some mistakes. Now, if ink spills, that's pretty catastrophic. And if it were paper, it probably means starting over again. If it's vellum, vellum is actually extremely resilient. And I had a piece. I mean, it's still a tragedy when tragedy strikes, but at least it's recoverable. So I was working on a piece, a massive commission. I was doing the hymn, The Old Rugged Cross, and it was highly detailed, super ornamental, beautiful script. And I just laid down all of the script from the hymn. And so I was going back to my studio in the morning after a long workout and excited to get to work. And we had a cleaning crew that had come to our house that day. And they had left by the time I got there, but I went back to my studio and someone had taken a wet rag to my art piece and just wiped it down thoroughly and smeared all the ink all over the piece. And I had dozens of hours into the piece at this point. I had done like a lot of oil painting in the border and all of my script was ruined. It shocked me. I fell to my knees and was like trembling when I saw it. And so that's the biggest tragedy that's happened. And so what I had to do, like because it was on calfskin vellum, I was able to take a razor blade and scrape the surface off of the rest of the ink where it was there. And then where the ink had been smeared over all of my painting, I used Q-tips and my own saliva, which is an art restorer's technique because your saliva has an enzyme in it that actually breaks down the binders in the ink. And the binder in Sumi ink is gum arabic, which is even used in like salad dressings and things. So I had to go centimeter by centimeter with a Q-tip and my own saliva, like pull the ink. So I had to play art restorer before I could become artist again and get back to work on the piece. So yeah, I mean, tragedy does strike now and then, and you have to start over. I mean, it felt like destroying so much, like finishing off the job that, the blessed cleaning lady had started.
Certainly didn't get a good, I'm assuming good Google review afterwards.
No, definitely not.
Oh my God, that's hilarious. Wow. So it's interesting, one question I definitely have regarding the work and how many hours it gets to be when you're working on these projects. I was sharing this with my other designers on the team. It's some of the images that were sent over to us and we were just geeking out. And one of our designers, Joey, was like, how does he even have that time to create all of this incredible stuff? Like, it's one thing if you're just a master penman, but then you're also almost like Renaissance style, Renaissance level
Mm,
in terms of your ability to understand the human form and
mm,
just drawing in particular. And I'm curious, given that you've got 4 kids,
yeah,
you have a wife,
yeah,
that's a lot of demands,
yeah,
not negative demands, but they are demands for your time, right?
sure,
Resources are finite when it comes
yeah,
to, being present for family time. And I
right,
know that I've seen images, video of, family hanging out at, maybe at your studio and purchase book. Of course, I'm thinking about young kids just knocking something over. I'd be like
yeah,
incredibly like,
that's happened,
don't touch it, don't touch, keep away over here, over here.
right?
So, but I am curious, like, how do you make time for mastery
Mm,
while also making time for family?
ooh, man, that is so beautifully said. That
And I'm asking for a friend, meaning myself.
I think it comes down to a level of intentionality in everything that you do. And that's hard. I will say it's hard to live at the level of intensity that I tend to, but I think there is something for like, being able to take your work seriously without taking yourself seriously, and just being able to be accessible. And I think like I know where my priorities lie. Like my kids, my family, that comes first. Always will, like full stop. And so one of the ways that I want to be really well practiced, as much as I want to be well practiced in any of the different mediums that I do, is I want to be well practiced as a family man who makes art. And so part of that is like, yes, there are times when I have to be sequestered away in my studio, and the kids have to know like dad's at work. You can't bother him. But then there's other times where it's like I invite them into the studio. I don't want them to feel like they're constantly in competition with the things that I am making, because I want them to respect it. If they always felt sort of in competition with it, there would be sort of an animosity that grew within them
Yeah.
by feeling like they were always bypassed or overlooked for
Hmm.
what I was working on. So
Yep.
instead, it's like they are in my studio, whether it's my calligraphy studio or in the wood shop even, it's like my kids will come out, and, my son Henry, he sees me carving. He's like, I want to do that. And so I'll set
Hmm.
him up with scrap of wood with a wood chisel, and, I get to teach him the art form while I'm still working. And so I have these like beautiful moments. I mean, it's like I get more tickled about it than I think he does, that it's like, here's my son Henry chiseling away right next to me in my studio. It's like they're beautiful moments that actually aren't competition to the work, but they actually heighten the experience of the work and draw me into a deeper level of it. And so, and that takes time. I used to talk about my creative capacity is like a locomotive. It takes a long time to ramp up the momentum in order for me to get into it, and I can't do a hard stop because that just results in a train wreck. And I'm just fixated on that piece, even though I'm pulled away from my work at a moment's notice. I'm like frustrated, and I feel like super aggravated about it. And a lot of times the frustration I feel about being interrupted in my work is longer lasting than the interruption itself. In
Mm.
that, just in my ability to stew, like I'm just perpetuating the train wreck at that point. So I will say, like, being a father of four and working from home, I've turned from somewhat of a locomotive into a metro train. It's like there's lots of starts and stops that
Right.
I
Right.
do, but it's not nearly as catastrophic as it once was. And I still get to my destination on time. That is, I do whatever I have to. If it means, working nights while the kids are down, or, finding like I like writing my last book, I was doing it in every scenario you can imagine, like taekwondo practice, on road trips, just wherever you can to find those moments and be better at being able to do work even in those like less than ideal circumstances, which I think is actually, it's a natural superpower of the artist.
I have to imagine you being such a, at least artistically, very disciplined. You seem to be very disciplined in general. You have to be very disciplined with your time.
Yeah.
Does your, what does your work week, and even do you work during the weekend as well? What does that look like? Are you, up with the kids for a couple hours and then off to work for six, or, and then what does that look like? Do you work beyond your, you know, before you were talking about like working till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm sure you don't do that anymore.
No, because when I try and work late, even when I try and work till like 12 or midnight, inevitably I'll go to bed and one of the kids will be up at 2 o'clock, and then it just becomes like an all nighter. So I don't know why that is. That just always tends to be the case. Murphy's Law, I guess, applied to parenting.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's somewhat of a traditional schedule of just getting up, getting to be with the family in the morning, going to the gym, having a workout, and then coming down and just getting stuck in. As that's always my like code word to my wife. I was like, all right, I'm going to get stuck in, and she knows to sort of like give me as much margin as possible, make sure that the kids aren't too invasive, or that she's not bothering me with something. Because I do, especially when it's something intense like the big wood carving that I was working on for the last couple years, or now I'm doing like a hyper realistic painting on vellum. I need to be able to know that I don't need my peripherals on. Like, I can truly be centered
Yeah,
on the
the
work
zone.
and not waiting for something to tap me on the shoulder.
Yeah. I want to try and squeeze out another 10 minutes to get a couple of extra topics in there, if that's okay with you.
Sure, sure.
Firstly, maybe speak to me a little bit about, some of the misconceptions about where you see your style of art these days. Are you encouraged by perhaps the attention you've received from the work that you've done, considering the fact that in a lot of ways, I would say that your work is seen as sort of a lost art.
Mm,
It's interesting because, you look at like, we've got books and books and books and books and books on creation, creatives and artists, and it's graphic design. And I'm always stunned by the amount of highly detailed, skilled work that was, before 1965,
mm.
not using a computer, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Just to this point where somebody recently was looking at your work. I might have been even one of my daughters who said something like, it looks like something that it should be on, a currency, right? Like a dollar bill or something like that,
Yeah,
right?
that's
And
a
that
great
is just
compliment.
something, yes, yeah. So I'm curious, are you encouraged by the attention you get because it helps sort of raise this medium in awareness, and by that way you're sort of raising the attraction for it? Where do you sit with that these days, when you seem to be almost, not exclusively, but in a lot of ways seemingly a lone wolf in this, sort of style of work that you do?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, and all of the art forms that I practice are, I just have an attraction, I think, to the old antiquated crafts.
Yes, same.
So, it's penmanship, it's classical painting, it's wood carving. I still, on occasion, I still have to I do like some brand work or publishing work, or some of like the printing styles require vectorization and digitization. And so I still know decently how to use an iPad. And way back in 2015, Apple reached out to me to launch the very first iPad Pro. And so, which was
Really?
crazy. Yeah, it was absolutely crazy to me. And I was like, what I do, right? I work with a dip pen. Like I am not some like digital artist. And I was like, I don't know how this is gonna go.
Yeah.
And actually, when we got in the room, they had the engineer and the designer for Procreate in the room. And
Wow.
they're like, Jake, we've looked at your style, and here's a tool, here's a pen, or like a brush tool that we designed just for you. And I put it down, tried it, and it was all wrong. It was like this broad edge
I knew it.
word pen that was like twirling and everything else. And I was like, okay, well, here we go. This is where it doesn't translate. We're going to be stuck. And they wanted me to produce like an art piece in a matter of a week to shoot in a Hollywood studio for the commercial. And
Wow.
so I was like, oh, this is just too much pressure. But I was like, for whatever reason, I don't know, maybe it's a Boy Scout in me being prepared for everything, but I brought my pen and inkwell with me because I didn't know. I was like, maybe they want me to design
Yes.
a logo. Like, I don't know what they
Yeah.
want. And so I said, hey, I've got my calligraphy pen. Can I show you how it works? And so in this like surreal moment, I'm surrounded by a bunch of computer geniuses, and I'm showing them how this dip pen works and giving them a crash course in calligraphy. And it was so amazing to see the designer and engineer of Procreate going back and forth, going like, oh, okay, yeah, well, we'll change this parameter to this and change this parameter to this. And they type it into their laptop. They program the iPad, unplug it, hand it back to me. And I pick up the pen and tried it out. And I was like, and it worked. And it was like fluid and mimicked very closely like the script pens. So that it'll always be like, I mean, that's one of those like pinnacle moments in my life where it's like there will always be a place in the digital age for for the analog. And I think because my work is so displaced out of time, becomes the thing that makes it all the more special, because it is so anachronistic that people just, they value it all the more. It draws them in and makes them curious all the more. But a lot of times it feels, like I'm John Henry going up against, the steam machine, especially with the amount of time something takes me. It does take a very, very long time. And so back to your level of like how to live with that kind of intensity. It's like I think of Treebeard from Lord of the Rings when he talks about the language of the trees, and he says it takes a very long time to say anything in our language. And so my art forms are like the language of the trees. It takes a very long time to create anything, and I don't want to create anything unless it is worth taking a long time to create it. And so that all the more is like it brings all the more conviction in as to what I am representing through my art form, and also making sure that I am diligent. Because while I am slow, I'm not idle, but I'm also not in a rush to make bad art. And so I'm going to take my time in whatever it is that I do. And that is from another age. And in our age of like the quick and the disposable and the digital and the instantaneous, that's probably the hardest thing to cope with on a regular basis. But as far as the mediums themselves, I'm actually deeply encouraged that we seem to be in something of a renaissance of craft right now. And you're seeing everything from, calligraphy. Like when I joined, there was like maybe a couple hundred members to that association. There's now thousands worldwide. And every single conference is, like 3 or 4 times what that first one was, and it sells out every year. So, that's a great testimony to the rise of calligraphy. But you see that with hand engraving, which is another art form that I do. You see that with wood carving. My friend is a blacksmith. I mean, you wouldn't think that would come back the way that it has, but there are these, I think, with the rise with so much digitization around us, and I think especially with the rise of AI, craft is king right now.
Okay. I have 2 more thoughts. If you were to share just a little bit, if you could tease this out just a little bit more. My question to you is, maybe if you're speaking specifically to, if we were to go a little bit full circle, you are somebody who is on this quest for connection, right? And we
Yeah.
talked about this idea of, to are a small business person. You are in the business of using your arts for commerce.
Mhm.
And when we think about AI being so prominent, what message would you say? And you've outlined it a little bit, but if there's anything more that you think that you could say, you're at your soapbox and you have an opportunity to share this with the listeners here. One, for those who are perhaps nervous about their livelihood, think something that they're very passionate about, whether they're illustrators or designers or graphic artists, or conversely, on the other side of the spectrum, those who would typically be the client.
Yeah.
What would you say to them is the value of, quote unquote, the craft, and why it's important still to this day?
I think whenever it comes to a debate on any topic, it's important to define terms. And I think a lot of the confusion when it comes to AI and especially AI art, is we are using anthropomorphic terms for something that is, in the end, an artifact. It is a computer, it is a line of code. And so in that sense, we're going beyond sort of the trompe l'oeil, the trick of the eye, into trompe l'esprit, or trompe l'esprit, which is a trick of the mind. When we give ourselves over into the thought that it's like this computer actually created this, and it's like, well, creation is exclusively the role of man. G.K. Chesterton said in his book, The Everlasting Man, dig far enough down in the earth, and there you will find that man has drawn a picture of a reindeer. No matter how far you dig, you will never find that a reindeer has drawn a picture of a man, for art is the signature of man. And so he says, it's like we look at our earliest ancestors, the cavemen, and the anthropologists of the day accuse them of being mere brutes, but there is no real sign of them being brutes. But what there is signs left of them are that they were artists, that beyond the mere, industrial work of the termite or the beaver, like man did something that was purely creative, purely expressive. And so that is the signature of man. And I don't think that just because a computer comes around that is going to automatically displace the role of man when it comes to creation. And we've seen this, like, that's the other thing, is like history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme, that famous quote from Mark Twain. But because it's like, you look at like when the printing press came along, there was a commentator that, and this one strikes very close to home for me, said that, monks used to dedicate their entire life to the written word. And they would spend day after day carefully writing out letter by letter sacred words throughout history. And now you have a printing press that can spit out page after page before supper is on the table. And that was sort of the warning when the printing press came along. And then you have the advent of the camera, which I believe was 1839. And one classical painter by the name of Paul Delaroche declared, "From today, painting is dead." And it's like, you look back at that and you think like that is shocking. Just as AI seems to be a very shocking technology, those were all shocking technologies that were likewise stepping on the creative toes of man.
Disruptive, as they say now.
Yeah. But I don't think it is going to displace it, because I think there is something in the human spirit that is always going to want to create. And so, you look at like, there are unbelievable like oil painters today who are painting like hyper realism, that are still pushing the craft to that nth degree. And there's something special to it. And I think what it all comes down to is meaning. And meaning is far more is a natural part of something that is created by man, by hand, rather than something that is automated through a computer. And so I think that it does need to spur a conversation amongst us artists, especially as to what we value in the art itself, and bring that all the more to the table. And I think that comes in just infusing our work with all the more depth of meaning in everything that we create.
Beautiful. My final question to you is, if you could sit down and watch any artist in history work for one day, who would it be and why?
I mean, probably, there's so many to choose from. Okay, I would love to know how Michelangelo worked, being just the man that he was, and especially like chiseling in marble that is so incredibly complex, and you have to work like an engineer, and just using all analog tools and not even having things like protective eyewear. Like, did he glint at every chisel blow? And I don't know if it's like true to history, but I think in the ecstasy and the agony, he did talk about getting a shard of marble in the eye that incapacitated him for a while.
Oh.
So it's like, how did he work like that? How did he work for such long hours? I know he sort of discussed his process quite a bit, but I'd love to see how he worked. That would be amazing. Another one from penmanship would be Louis Madaraz. He was regarded as the king of penman. He came up with
How do you spell his last name?
Madaraz, Madarsz. So king of penman, he came up with the serif script, which is where we get the Coca-Cola logo. But everyone was so enamored by his style, because his pen strokes were so hairline smooth, and his shaded strokes were so dramatic, and he never seemed to put a stroke wrong. I'd love to know how he worked, and I'd love to see him write. Great question. Gosh.
Wow.
I'm
going to have to definitely look up his work for sure. Jake, this has been absolutely fantastic spending time with you for the past hour and a half. We will have to do this again, because I've got so many more questions. We'll see if we can find a spot for it sometime in the future that works for you. It has been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate you taking the time, and let's do this again sometime. Thank you so much.
That sounds great, Mike. Thank you so much.
Thanks for spending a little bit of time with us. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram for all things Pencil Pushers at the Pencil Pushers Podcast. And if you want to see what I'm up to, you can check out my brand studio on Instagram at MRC Brand Design and my own personal spot at Ikimodasser. That's my name, Mike Rosado, spelled backwards. EKIMODASOR. So that wraps it up for me. Until the next one, be safe, be kind, and see you next time.